In 1816, summer almost disappeared. Across parts of the northern hemisphere, temperatures dropped, crops failed, skies turned unusually dark, and snow appeared during months when people expected sunshine. Farmers watched their fields struggle. Food prices climbed. Families went hungry. And in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, people began experiencing a strange and frightening year that would later become known as the year without a summer. The cause was not a war. It was not a new disease. And it was not simply an unusually cold winter. The story began on a tropical island thousands of miles away. On April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora erupted on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia. It was one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The explosion was enormous. The mountain released vast quantities of ash, rock, and volcanic gases high into the atmosphere. Communities near the volcano were devastated. Thousands of people died immediately or soon afterward, and many more died from hunger and disease as the eruption destroyed crops and disrupted food supplies. But the effects did not remain near Tambora. The volcano had sent enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. There, the gas formed tiny particles called sulfate aerosols. These particles spread through the atmosphere and reflected some incoming sunlight back into space. The result was a cooling effect across much of the northern hemisphere. The eruption happened in 1815, but the most dramatic consequences arrived in 1816. By then, people thousands of miles from Indonesia were experiencing weather that seemed almost impossible. In parts of North America, summer temperatures were unusually low. Frost appeared during the growing season. Snow fell in places where people expected warm summer weather. In New England, June brought freezing conditions. Farmers watched crops fail. Fields that should have been green were damaged by frost. Corn struggled to mature. Oats and wheat were affected. The problem was not limited to North America. Across Europe, the weather was also unusually cold and wet. The continent was already struggling to recover from the Napoleonic Wars. Now agriculture faced another disaster. Rain damaged crops. Cold weather shortened the growing season. Food became more expensive. Poor families suffered the most. In some areas, people searched for wild plants and other foods to survive. The crisis spread through markets and communities. When harvests failed, food prices rose. When prices rose, poor families had less food. When people had less food, disease and malnutrition became more dangerous. The year without a summer was therefore not simply a strange weather event. It became a humanitarian crisis. In Switzerland, the weather was particularly miserable. Heavy rain and cold temperatures disrupted agriculture. People struggled to find enough food. And one group of travelers experienced the strange summer firsthand. They were staying near Lake Geneva. Among them was a young English poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley. His future wife, Mary Godwin, was also there. Another famous poet, Lord Byron, was part of the group. They had traveled to Switzerland expecting beautiful summer weather. Instead, they found dark skies, relentless rain, and cold conditions. They spent long periods indoors. The weather was so gloomy that normal summer activities became difficult. One evening, the group gathered inside their rented villa. The storm continued outside. The atmosphere was dark and mysterious. Lord Byron suggested that each person should write a ghost story. Mary was only 18 years old. At first, she struggled to think of an idea. Then she imagined a scientist who wanted to create life. She imagined a human body assembled from dead parts. She imagined electricity bringing that creation to life. And she imagined the horror that would follow. That idea became Frankenstein. Mary Shelley eventually wrote Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It became one of the most influential novels in literary history. The Year Without a Summer did not single-handedly create Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was influenced by many ideas, including contemporary scientific experiments, discussions about electricity and life, Gothic literature, and philosophical questions. But the strange weather and confinement of 1816 clearly helped create the atmosphere in which the story was born. The world outside the villa was cold, wet, and dark. Inside, Mary Shelley imagined a creature brought to life through science. It was an extraordinary product of an extraordinary summer. But while writers were creating stories, ordinary people were struggling to survive. In Europe, food shortages became severe. Grain prices increased. In some regions, people rioted over food. Horses became more expensive to feed. Transportation and trade were affected. Poor families were pushed toward desperation. The crisis became especially severe in Switzerland. The harvest failures were so serious that authorities and communities struggled to provide enough food. People were forced to rely on emergency assistance. Some families left their homes in search of better conditions. The famine also affected Ireland. Potato crops were damaged by the cold and wet conditions. People who depended heavily on potatoes faced serious hardship. Across the Atlantic, farmers in the northeastern United States also suffered. Some abandoned crops and moved toward warmer regions. The unusually cold weather changed agricultural decisions for years afterward. Farmers had experienced something they did not fully understand. They could not see the volcanic particles high above the atmosphere. They did not know that a volcano thousands of miles away was altering the amount of sunlight reaching their fields. To them, the weather simply seemed unnatural. Summer had become strangely cold. The sky could appear hazy. Sunsets became unusually vivid. Temperatures could fall suddenly. Frost could arrive during the growing season. And every unexpected cold night could threaten an entire harvest. The volcanic aerosols did not remain forever. Gradually, they settled and dispersed. The climate eventually returned toward normal. But the consequences continued. Food shortages had already caused economic disruption. Communities had suffered. Families had lost crops. And people had been forced to change their plans simply to survive. The event also demonstrated something important about the Earth's atmosphere. A single enormous volcanic eruption could affect climate far beyond the region where it occurred. Tambora was in Indonesia, but its atmospheric effects were felt across the northern hemisphere. The eruption had created a chain reaction. A volcano erupted. Sulfur dioxide entered the atmosphere. Aerosols formed. Sunlight was reduced. Temperatures fell. Crops failed. Food prices increased. And human society suffered. The event was a reminder that climate does not respect political borders. A disaster beginning on one island could eventually affect people thousands of miles away. And 1816 left another legacy. The year became part of the history of climate science. Scientists today understand much more about why it happened. Modern research has reconstructed temperature records, volcanic deposits, ice cores, tree rings, and atmospheric chemistry. These records show that Tambora had a major influence on global and regional climate. The eruption was so powerful that its effects were measurable long after the explosion itself. But for the people living through 1816, none of this science existed. They did not know what was happening above them. They only knew that the seasons seemed broken. They expected summer. Instead, they got cold. They planted crops. Then frost destroyed them. They waited for sunshine. Instead, rain continued. They expected the harvest to feed their families. Instead, food became scarce. That is what made the year without a summer so frightening. It attacked something people depended on but could not control. The seasons, the harvest, the weather, and ultimately, survival. Yet from this period of darkness came one of the most famous horror stories ever written. Inside a cold and stormy villa near Lake Geneva, Mary Shelley imagined a scientist who crossed the boundary between life and death. The world outside was behaving strangely. Inside, she created a story about a world transformed by human ambition. Frankenstein would eventually become far more than a ghost story. It became a warning about scientific responsibility, isolation, ambition, and the consequences of creating something that cannot be controlled. The strange summer of 1816 eventually ended. The skies cleared. Temperatures recovered. The crops returned. And life slowly moved forward. But the memory remained. Mount Tambora had changed the world without anyone in Europe or North America knowing why. It had shown how connected the planet really was. One eruption could darken skies thousands of miles away. A few degrees of cooling could destroy harvests. Failed harvests could create hunger. Hunger could create migration, poverty, and unrest. And a summer without sunshine could inspire a story that would remain famous for more than 2 centuries. 1816 was supposed to be another summer. Instead, it became a year remembered for cold skies, failed harvests, hunger, and fear. And somewhere between the rain outside and the candlelight inside, Mary Shelley began writing a story that would become immortal. A volcano had changed the climate. The climate had changed people's lives. And that strange, dark summer helped give the world Frankenstein.